So there are priority seats available if you need them or help with any other questions about accessibility. Speak to a volunteer in high vis. Fire exits are located right there, and there's a big sign. We might take photos throughout the event to use in publicity. If you do not want to appear in any photos, there are some bright yellow stickers around. Alternatively, please just speak to someone and we will not put photos of you anywhere public if you don't want that. We do expect people to adhere to our code of conduct, to keep safe and friendly for everyone. There are printouts around the venue. This session is being recorded. Again, if you don't want to, I think it would just be mostly kind of us talking, but again, if you don't want to appear in anything, please do just let someone know. I'm just going to pass you over to Amy, who's going to do a bit of an introduction, and then we've got a few kind of interactive sessions, so you will be forced to talk to the people around you. But I'm just going to hand you over to Amy, who's just going to kind of introduce this for us.
Thank you, Daisy. So my name's Amy. I am a social worker and also someone that did some research into prevent duty and how safeguarding is co-opted by that statutory duty. So that's like some context around. I don't pretend to be an expert on radical safeguarding. It's just something that I'm interested in, both as a social worker, but both because of my research as well. So hopefully this will be kind of a collaborative session where we can actually learn from each other. It's particularly relevant to people that are duty bound by prevent, but that is actually 5 million people in the UK, so it's teachers, nurses, social workers, youth workers, that kind of thing. But I think also just as leftists it's good for us to be aware of these things. So I think I might do it on the laptop, yeah. So first of all, what is prevent? So it's part of wider counter-terrorism strategy that is meant to reduce the risk of terrorism in the UK, and specifically the government says it's so that people can go about their lives freely and with confidence. It's part of contest, but it's the 4 Ps. We won't bother with the other 3, but they exist. And then prevent is specifically about stopping people becoming terrorists or supporting terrorism. The way that it's underpinned is by an assertion that there's a causal relationship between extremism and then a propensity for violence through a process of radicalisation. So it's a kind of basic sum of extremism plus radicalisation equals terrorism. As I said just now, it is after the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act in 2015, it became a statutory duty for all public sector workers that have safeguarding responsibilities. Teachers in schools, colleges, further education, NHS workers, professionals in local authorities, and it goes beyond that, so even people that work in like football clubs with children, for example. What's quite unique about this is that whilst other countries like the Netherlands and the USA have some sort of prevent-type policy, we are alone as the only country in the world where this is a statutory duty. The government says it sits alongside long-established safeguarding duties, so the idea is that it doesn't create more work for people, and professionals in all their different contexts are trained to spot those observable signs that an individual is likely to be radicalised. So that constructs the notion of the at-risk person who's vulnerable. Once professionals have spotted this vulnerable, at-risk person that might be radicalised, they are then referred to the police. There's a multi-agency panel, which is called Channel, which is run by the local authority, and they decide if that referral is appropriate. Those scare quotes are deliberate. Then they are then offered, if they meet the threshold, a consent-based multi-agency plan that delivers services such as mental health support, mentoring, direct work around contextual safeguarding. So that all sounds like fairly innocuous, fairly nice, not much to worry about. Or is there? We're now going to hand over to the first exercise. We're just going to introduce you to what that is and what we hope you're going to get out of that. Or I'm going to introduce it.
You introduce it.
Okay. So I might have to click on. On your table, you will see extracts from actual prevent guidance for schools, NHS and other settings. We haven't specifically said which ones it is, but all of this is lifted directly from policy guidance training. What we want you to do is discuss in your groups your interpretations of this guidance, what's jumping out at you, what seems strange, problematic, okay, valid, like just talk amongst yourselves about what that guidance is saying to you. And then, well, I don't know how long we're doing that for. 5 minutes.
Actually,
Very
that's not true.
rapid.
10 minutes.
10 minutes. So for 10 minutes, talk amongst yourselves, and then we'll come back, we'll have a roving mic, and you can start telling us sort of your thoughts.
People have had the chance to kind of read the majority of what's been down there. Apologies, I might have made that slightly confusing because I'd already left the kind of real-life prevent referral scenarios on the table to start with, and then we put something else out maybe without being quite clear. But the stuff that was on the tables to begin with was like real-life referrals to prevent, coming from the Rights Watch report on it. And then the stuff that Ribs handed out was the extracts from the prevent guidance. Hopefully it's kind of clear which is which there. But I think we're going to go to every table and just kind of have a minute or so of like what you guys talked about, what you thought, anything particular that jumped out. So I'm going to pick on Emily's table first of all, but if anyone from this table would like to just kind of feedback, let us know what you thought. Yeah.
So is this on the smaller slips of paper? Yeah. Yeah, we just kind of broke them down and said it was the gist of it was like the kind of with us or against us, and there was a very, very broad definition of what with us meant, and similarly broad what against us, and it was all quite vague and seemed like it could be used for any kind of purposes, essentially. And yeah, we just kind of talked about that in detail.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the problems with it, and I think the case now is something about like 90% of prevent referrals have no further action, and obviously a couple of reasons for that. One, I guess people that work in those industries are kind of scaremongered into reporting everything and being really surveillant, but also absolutely the guidance is so vague with words like extremism and like extreme political views, kind of that can mean absolutely anything to any one different person, which obviously, now what that's leading to now is a massive, massive over-referral. And even to the extent that the government, the people that they're being referred to, think, why have you referred this? We're not going to do anything with it. So people in those industries are over-referring even by the kind of government counter-terrorism standards, really. If you guys are done with the table kind of in the middle, sorry.
No, keep going, yeah.
We were saying, what I was saying that obviously one of the main goals of prevent is to turn your standard citizen into a cop essentially, and that its main goal is to expand the police state basically, and turn those 5 million people into everyday cops.
Yeah, absolutely.
100%. If when you're kind of feeding back, if you can point out which thing you're looking at, if relevant.
Okay. Well, we read quite a lot of the case studies.
Oh.
I think we misunderstood.
No, that was our fault. That's our fault.
No. But we were. I suppose we were talking linked to that and linked to what's just been said. That the vagueness creates room for bigotry to be the main. So like, if you're a racist and for you extremist means Muslim, then your kind of everyday ignorance of Islam will then, as in many of these case studies, turn into unnecessary referrals. But then also with the one that we did actually have, I think I've always found the kind of the inclusion of the rule of law in the so-called fundamental British values to be the kind of chilling one, because law is arbitrary, obviously, and doesn't mean we can't call for different laws. So that, I think, in terms of a vagueness that creates sort of paranoia, that seems like a particularly egregious reason.
On that point, I work in an educational context, and I had a discussion with a colleague who literally said, we should never challenge the laws of our state. And he's not a stupid man. Well, up until that point, I didn't think he was stupid, and then I was like, okay. And I tried to name like suffragette movement and females not having rights and things like that, and he wouldn't back down. And I think, obviously, that's a little bit toxic masculinity, but it's also stuff like this where actually there's an encouragement within my profession to hold views like that about the rule of law and its kind of infallibility. It's like religious in its in the way we're being asked to implement it. I think that's really scary.
Yeah, thank you. Any more from that table? Don't have to, there's no pressure. Great. Yeah, so Rob, over to your table, or whoever's speaking.
I think we mostly spoke about not just that things were quite vague, but also like the breadth of like things that it suggests you could be referred for. So that it goes from like sharing extreme views, which you might expect, but then things like personal crisis, mental health issues, looking to blame others, desire for status, and just that, you know, that's so wide-ranging, and those are all so vague. It's not like surprising that there's a huge over-referral. You know, if you took that to like the letter of the law, that would like cover, you know, lots of, I guess, fairly normal teenage behaviour of like having mental health issues, like trying to find meaning and belonging and things like that.
Yeah, I think that I find that one particularly interesting. Yeah, how you can spot those signs. You know, our government is always talking about we need change, but apparently if you're angry for the desire for change, that makes you risky. Also, like, let's all talk about our mental health. It's not a stigma. If you have mental health issues, you could be a terrorist. So yeah, it's particularly confusing. And the need for identity, meaning and belonging. Isn't that like a human condition? Okay, sorry.
I was going to say, in terms of the extremism as well, I thought it was quite interesting. You're saying that we should always follow the law regardless of what the law is. To me, that's a very extreme position as well as an illogical one.
We should probably refer
So
that fully to prevent.
Yeah, we had, the one we talked about most was this one that was people who've been radicalised may have a misconception and or rejection of UK foreign policy. Which, like, I mean, the polling on Gaza was like, what, 90% of people think that Britain shouldn't send arms to Israel? So, what, 90% of people have been radicalised? Or, like, it's worded in such a way of, like, oh, well, you know, it may have been, or may, and it's I think as well, like, including that in training, the purpose of it is to say to people, you are not allowed to talk about British foreign policy at your job. You are not allowed to talk about it with other adults. Like, it's just to have that chilling effect. And it will make people uncomfortable and not willing to do it and all of this kind of stuff. Yeah, it's bad.
Yeah, that's mine and Daisy's favourite. We love that one. And then, because it's crazy. Yeah, any more from that table?
I think the bit about misconception of UK foreign policy, I can't imagine anyone who doesn't have some misconception. But as a teacher, I know we also have massive difficulty talking about UK foreign. We're not, you know, we are. A lot of people have been stifled in talking about Israel and Palestine at all within schools, and actually educating, positive education on the actual facts. So it's funny to have, oh, you've got this misconception, but unfortunately your educators can't educate you about it, so you're just going to have to be stuck with whatever misconception you've got. And I think that's, yeah, the only option is TikTok or wherever else you may get radicalised, you know.
Yeah.
So there's no alternative.
There was, we'll put it in the reading list afterwards, but there's a great book called The Emergence of Extremism, which was written by a teacher that was able to trace over these policies becoming more embedded, people in his classroom. He was in Tower Hamlets, so it's a Muslim majority school, and children just stopping talking about anything that was related to foreign policy or their experience of Islamophobia, just like completely got that shut down. Anyway, sorry.
Just to point out, I once heard a history teacher. I once heard a history teacher tell a student, "You will never understand the so-called Israel-Palestine conflict." You've got an extraordinary message for teachers. give up now.
Sorry. In our school, we had a long-standing geography unit looking at Israel-Palestine from, you know, hopefully a sort of factual, neutral perspective, if there is such a thing. And as soon as the war broke out, my school decided to just pull it. So that was the response, was like, oh, can't touch it. And I just think it's a betrayal of the next generation. I feel so angry about it.
Yeah, I work in a school and we had a similar thing. I had kind of raised an issue about the fact we aren't saying anything about it, and we have a kind of pastoral curriculum we deliver as tutors, and they said to me, okay, well, you can make something, you know, classic, if you care so much about it, why don't you make some resources? So I did, and made some kind of very inoffensive on where I work in a school, and like what you can say and what you can't say, and made some kind of very black, you know, like as uncontroversial as you can get, very factual, whatever, and was told that they can't be delivered because staff won't feel confident enough talking about it, and actually staff don't know enough about it, as that's the reason why we can't educate ourselves and others. And I had a couple of students in my tutor group where we were talking about it, and I was talking about Gaza and things like that, and they were saying, we should learn about things like this, why don't we? And I basically had to say to them, it's because people that run these institutions are kind of cowards, and they're so scared. It's because of fear. They're so scared of a backlash. And I think now actually, how many complaints are you really going to get in a school for doing a quite factual thing of like these people are being kind of bombed to shit and it's really bad and they don't have any food, but there's this big imaginary fear of, you know, what if someone kicks off that it just becomes kind of too cowardly to talk about anything really. Before Rob's got his hand up, and then if we can kind of have maybe one or two more things and move on, if that's possible.
I was just going to say, well, obviously I'm not a teacher, but it just reminds me, it's amazing how much things have changed, because I remember being at school, being 11 or 12, on September the 12th, 2001, and I remember our teacher, I can't remember what class it was, but the whole class was just, he went, so what do you guys think, to 11-year-olds, what do you think you know about this? And people were openly saying, well, like, what do you think you know about Afghanistan? Because obviously the war against Afghanistan was already being talked about, and they were like, well, I just imagine they're kids like us, and people saying things like, well, America has done a lot of bad things, like, did they not expect something to blow back at them at some point? Like, in a school, like, we wouldn't, you know, we would have all been prepared, but because of 9/11 and the war on terror they've created since then, like, so much has changed.
Yeah, fantastic. So we kind of, when we were planning this session, we kind of talked about this first section as the like why it's bad section, and then or why it's got problems, section, and then we're kind of thinking about alternatives. So Amy's just going to kind of, I guess, wrap that prevent bad bit up, and then start thinking about some alternatives and like what a radical safeguarding approach might look like for people who are suffering with extremist views or whatever.
Amazing, thank you. So hopefully, a lot of what we were just talking about is hopefully going to come through in this next section. So we're just going to like recap. What is the deal with prevent duty? We obviously covered up his face because he's a Zionist, but and that's me looking really upset about prevent duty. That also just wanted to pull out one other thing that was within the excerpts as well. It's like that thing of like, we're already doing it, it's not going to take any more time. But actually, these are like referrals of paperwork, they take time, you have to have meetings about it, then you have to do. Actually, the whole point about radical safeguarding is that it truly does just happen because you are yourself, you know, practicing and like engaging with young people as you are. You know, you don't need to do anything, you don't have to write any paperwork, it's great. So, what is the deal with prevent? This first one is like the kind of political geography of prevent. People definitely talked about this. The terms are ambiguous and they're confusing, and there isn't consensus about what they mean. They change over time, they shapeshift, and we have to ask the question, who is defining these terms and why are they changing over time? So on the left there, that is apparently a representation of muscular liberalism, which was Cameron's idea, and then the lone wolf, which is Starmer's idea. But how are they co-opting these definitions to further their agenda? Apart from the fact that muscular liberalism and lone wolf, they kind of sound sexy, but they're not. And actually what we need to think about is terrorism itself is a term that, you know, is it a useful term? I would argue not. But if you're going to look at it as objectively as possible, it's a method of violence, and it's used by lots of different actors, and it's regardless of their belief systems and who's carrying it out. So these sort of changes of definitions are not helpful. Particularly Theresa May, in all her glory, when she was PM, and actually when she was Home Secretary as well, she shifted the definition of it to make it ideological. So she talked about Islamist extremism as an evil ideology. It will only be defeated when we turn people's minds away from this violence and make them understand that our values, pluralistic British values, are superior to anything offered by preachers and supporters of hate. Now, what's quite interesting about that is that it's an explicit assertion that extremism is a rejection of the state. So that was the kind of idea about this misconception of UK foreign policy, or the one around, like death to armed forces. What it implies is that there's only one truth in things like the war on terror, and the British state is the sole arbiter of that. It also means that we start having these bigger questions that we have to ask ourselves, like, are there acceptable forms of political activism? And what are those? And that's contested as well. And also one of the problems about this sort of like, these nebulous definitions that change over time, but they've been part of our kind of like societal psyche now since 2001, is that they've also been adopted now as common sense. If you ask someone what they think, what is extremism, what is radicalisation, they'll probably give you an answer, but probably they'll be very different. Everyone will have a slightly different definition, and that's quite dangerous in itself as well. Also, this whole causal relationship thing is a complete fantasy. This whole idea of extremism plus radicalisation equals terrorism, and the idea as well that extremism, you can see who's vulnerable to radicalisation. There's no empirical research that underpins that whatsoever. There's no link between extremism and violence or terrorism. There's also no causal connection between theological persuasion and terrorism. There's no inherent violence with any particular radical beliefs. They are just a rejection of the status quo, and it doesn't have a predisposition for violent conduct. I don't think that's an oversight. I don't think it's an error. I don't think they made a mistake. To base that policy on empirical evidence would completely expose the fantasy on which those are built on. And the reams and reams of legislation and guidance and policy lends credibility and legitimacy, and it allows risk management tools to be mobilised. And the way that it's mobilised is by creating this at-risk and vulnerable individual that is placed in a pre-crime space. So that is from Minority Report. If you are vulnerable and you are at risk, it's actually a very politically powerful tool to allow safeguarding mobilisation. It completely ignores the idea of dynamics of power and privilege, and actually how it reinforces those social inequalities. There are specific groups that this particularly targets. So if you're thinking about like how do you see who is the vulnerable at-risk person, it means that you can also completely stereotype a particular group. And so whilst we're kind of talking about prevent duty today, there's also other forms of state-sanctioned like risk analysis and sort of like aversion to risk that affects disabled and neurodiverse communities, gypsy, Roma and traveller communities, immigrant communities, older people, racialised communities, queer and trans communities, working class people, women and girls. So all of these people can be kind of profiled as an at-risk subjectivity. And this whole pre-crime space thing is particularly worrying, given that like that Philip K. Dick, that's meant to be like dystopian, not something that we build policy around. And so this is done by, there's like 3 different ways it's done by, like so pathologization, or what some people call, I can never say this word, psychologicalization, I think that's it, depoliticization and securitization. So what I mean by the first one, which I don't want to say again, like the medicalization, if you frame this as an at-risk vulnerability, what that allows you to do is then start talking about therapeutic interventions that are like innocuous. And so, that whole idea of a channel referral is a safeguarding thing, it's nothing to be worried about. But what you're also doing is you're creating an idea of someone's individual mental health and well-being, and you're individualizing that. So things like exhibiting anger, mental health issues. I mean, come on. Angry desire for change, I have that. Personal crisis, every day. Time online, I never get off Instagram. Need for identity, meaning and belonging. Need to dominate, that is 100% me. Am I meant to be more at risk of this? And then the kind of depoliticization is particularly worrying and concerning. It completely divorces people from their kind of lived experiences and why they might be feeling angry, why their mental health might be impacted, and it makes it about emotional dysfunction and about the perception or imagined ideas of why they would be angry. I think that's particularly relevant when you think about far-right groups. You know, like the anger, I can understand the anger. Who they're angry at is the bit that we need to be worried about. And then finally, securitisation. I mean, what that means is it allows the complete performance of co-opting safeguarding, because you're saying it's like national security. What this leads to is surveillance, disproportionately targets people like British Muslims, and I mean, we've evidence in terms of like the higher proportion of Muslims in the community, the higher number of prevent referrals. Also, because it's securitised and a national security issue, it means that when you ask for information about how prevent referrals are dealt with, they say, oh, we can't give you that, it's national security. So it's not transparent. And yeah, it completely legitimised state surveillance. In fact, someone said it is the most elaborate system of surveillance that's ever been designed. And so, yeah, the consequences, we talked a little bit about that, about how people will then self-censor. And that happens in schools, in universities. I mean, I went to Nottingham University and someone was arrested on terror charges and detained for 12 days. They were writing a bloody thesis. And Nottingham University didn't come out and tell the police that that was what they were doing. Can you? Oh my God. So people are feeling alienated, disenfranchised, isolated, which are all the things that make you more angry. So, what is the deal with safeguarding radicalisation? So, this is co-opting neoliberal discourses, it's pathologising people, it's individualising people, but also, I think some people, so you mentioned your colleague who was like, you should never break the law is the letter of the thing. There are 5 million people that have to enact this policy, and not all of them are as rad as us, okay? So it means that, and they are configured by different sort of information that they consume, not just the training that they receive, which is not very good, but also the media and social commentary and the people that they're friends with, which is why you had one teacher refer a 5-year-old boy who drew a picture of a house and said, this is a terrorist house. He meant terrorist house, and he got referred to Prevent. There was an adult social worker who referred a vulnerable adult who had autism, who was into Warhammer. Because obviously she thinks that's weird. Obviously, like, that's completely subjective. So yeah, that is just, people are referring for all sorts of different reasons. I've got 10 minutes apparently, I'll hurry up. But what's the problem with safeguarding, co-opting safeguarding? I mean, the most obvious one is it erodes confidentiality and trust. These are the people that you're meant to be going to because you think they've got your back or they're there to protect you. But then, when families know that you are, teachers and social workers, all these people are being co-opted by the state into security, that doesn't fill people with trust. It also means that the discourse, the at-risk, risky, that's really problematic, because they're saying you can hold an at-risk and risky subjectivity at the same time, but it just means if you are potentially dangerous, you're already perceived as a threat even when you haven't done anything. My particular research, by the way, which we're not going to go into a lot of detail now, talks about how that at-risk, risky subjectivity it's not, as soon as you break that tension and then you do go on to commit an act of terrorism, for example, that tension completely breaks. So you were perceived as someone who was vulnerable, that needed protecting and safeguarding until you cross that threshold, and then they never want to. So serious case reviews are not conducted into children that go abroad to join organisations like Daesh and ISIS. Why is it that we had a duty apparently to safeguard those children? But once they've crossed that threshold, we don't want to know anymore. We're not reflective, we're not learning. So, that's why it's bad. So there's also some of the mechanisms that we use. And so this is more not just about prevent, but also things like knife crime, like gang violence, like that, all those sorts of things. And also problematic behaviour in classrooms from far right, that sort of stuff. Often we use things like exclusion, and exclusions mean that they are actually taken out of what is sort of as a place of safety. They're not in school anymore, they're not in their communities, they've been completely rejected and ostracised, and they're not in a learning environment, and they're not around their peers, so that in itself is, is dangerous. Also, for example, thinking about kind of deviating from prevent for a second, the way in which we talk about particular forms of violence against women and girls. When we think about honour-based violence and FGM, why is it that those are culturally loaded? So if it's, if a white woman experiences domestic abuse, it's domestic abuse. If it's a person of colour, then it's like honour-based. And so we're racialising, and we are creating profiles of individuals that need to be safeguarded. Before we move on to reframing it, I will just say, I'm sorry I spoke so quickly there, but I've been running out of time. So much burnout happens in things like nursing, social work, teaching, and that burnout is actually not because of the families and the communities that we're working with and the trauma that that vicarious trauma is real, but the burnout comes from operating in a system that is flawed. And we are now going to be talking about the kind of alternative, but I do also want everyone to kind of reflect and remind themselves and ground themselves in the idea that none of this is perfect, and sometimes we have to do things that we don't want to do. Sometimes we just can't fight every single battle. We can't protect everyone, all this kind of thing. But so be good to yourself. So, reframing safeguarding. We need to deconstruct risk courses. So you need to read that. So when you're thinking about the case studies that we go on to do, ask yourself questions. Are we being asked to profile risk based on identity of children? Where and how can we resist being complicit in those narratives? How do we safeguard young people of colour, including against profiling? How might the records that we are keeping be weaponised against these children in the future? How do we provide support based on the harms and long-term trauma? Also, is this in the child's best interest? Have that in mind. Is my decision to act going to create more harm than the harm that they are experiencing? How do I ground myself in that? How do I be good to myself? And then one of my favourite tools, reflecting in action and on action. So reflecting in action is being present in yourself, scan yourself before you go into these situations, being present in yourself to adapt to the person that is sitting in front of you, and then reflect after on that. How did that go? What could I have done differently? That kind of thing. So this, again, don't read it, so where we can start is a strength-based approach. Think about safety rather than risk. Every single person and family and community in this country has so many elements of safety already embedded into their lives. How do we strengthen those rather than talk about the risks all the time? Thinking about moving from trust to surveillance. So the focus is being risk sensible, working with people, thinking about structural and systemic considerations, the young people's voice. Surveillance is things like being individualised, focusing on crime, doing to someone. The method, consent-based, relationship-based, strength-based, having humility and reflection. Surveillance is oversharing things, being adversarial, disciplinary, relying on risk. And the impact, what we should be getting out of this is that we're empowering people to identify their own strengths and solutions. The interventions ease stress and shame. The relationships are built and they are strengthened. It increases safety and also, crucially, the no order principle. Avoid court. And then that's more for children, social care. Surveillance is around engagement and compliance. Am I following the letter of the policy? It pushes people away and it's punitive and security based. So relational trauma requires relational healing, so trauma understanding, compassion, safety, collaboration, cultural community, resilience and recovery. And so we need to be thinking about building relationships with families of children as well. And ask yourself the question, why do you think some families might feel intimidated or not confident when working with schools or social care or youth workers or whatever it might be? Why is that? Thinking about their generational trauma, their experience of power and how trauma affects your perception of power and authority. And then, again, reminding everyone to be committed, to be personal, to have your feelings embedded in what you're doing. Don't be afraid to bring yourself into your practice. That's really important, I think, and reflecting on your positionality. So this is some tips on language that you might want to think about when you're doing your things. So separating problem from person, moving from he's attention seeking to he's seeking connection. They're being disruptive. We need to support them to focus focus better. They're manipulative. They have found strategies to cope with their trauma. They're rude, aggressive, violent. They're showing a fear response. And then finally, empathy and repair. You've upset everyone. How do you think it might have felt for that person to have heard that? You're intimidating people. When you raise your voice, it can make people feel like this. You need to say sorry, actually bringing in the idea of accountability. You cannot return to school this week. I'm looking forward to seeing you later. and talking about what support you need. So, without further ado, now, I'm sorry, that was really fast. Was that on time, Daisy?
No, sure.
I'm just sorry, I could have gone on. Okay, so in your groups, look at the scenarios that you might come across in your workplaces. How might you approach these situations? Who would you talk to? How would you talk about it?
They are scenarios that we thought someone might think are worthy of a prevent referral. And like, this is not to think, I guess this is not for us to say like, should you be referring to the person to prevent, like what's the danger? What we want to think about is like, they all might, they all kind of represent working with a person who like might be at risk or might be potentially like posing what people might perceive as a risk. And it's just thinking about how would you approach the situation and not just thinking, you know, we refer someone to prevent and then wash their hands of it, because whether or not, you know, certain things would or wouldn't legally require a prevent referral is almost like that's not going to kind of solve things and protect people and protect everyone in that situation. So it's kind of thinking about how would you address these things, like what might you actually do in a helpful way in kind of those situations. So I've put a mixture of different scenarios and different tables, so kind of have a chat about what you've got there and what do you think. I just wanted to kind of, we'll do the same as last time of kind of going table by table, and just if you give us a minute or so of what you talked about, what you reckon. And if you just say what your scenario was when you're kind of saying. Ribs, have you got that mic? Thanks.
I forgot I was doing that.
We'll go the other way round this time. We'll start at this table in the back. If you guys want to just really quickly tell us what you talked about.
We talked about alternative ways to support the young person who's been shown an interest in taking climate activism to wanting to bomb the homes of BP execs. And she's had several experiences with the police, had a caution for violent disorder at a protest. She's just becoming like quite emotional and upset about the state of the planet regularly. And we're her social worker. What do we suggest? I think putting her in touch with appropriate professionals for like therapy and also support for mental health in terms of supporting her dealing with like her emotions towards the climate, but it needs to be the appropriate person who isn't just going to report to prevent.
I talked about maybe introducing her to other young people with the same ideas in environmental protection. I feel like when I read this, she seemed quite lonely and isolated, which a lot of young people can be. And I think getting her maybe, if she is online a lot, getting her out and about with like-minded young people that would support her, understand her politics and views more, I think would really help her emotionally. And yeah, and also if she is dealing with the police often, I was talking about maybe getting her some help. A lot of young people when dealing with the police aren't equipped with police tactics, and I think a lot of police can wind up people and put them in the wrong sort of state of mind. So yeah, I think it's about, you know, making sure young people have young people around them that can support them and have like a safe space.
Yeah, absolutely. Did anyone else want to jump in about the same scenario? If that's probably the better way to do it, actually.
We had the same scenario, and we looked at quite a lot of things. We spoke about like a therapy referral as well, and there are it's an organisation, I can't remember what it's called.
Yeah, the Climate Psychology Alliance will offer 3 free therapy sessions to anyone experiencing climate anxiety or environmental, I think it's called like panic. So yeah, that's Climate Psychology Alliance. That's a good one.
But we also spoke about validating. So well, yeah, it's maybe like she needs some kind of support with regulating the anger. It's totally reasonable that she's angry about it, like, and speaking to her about that in a really validating way, and being able to have a conversation maybe about tactics and organising. You know, she is feeling really angry, maybe. But you know, like actually like bombing the house of one individual and trying to get her to think more systematically, like that might, if she wants to get involved in that, she might want to think about other things. And we also had a discussion about, I think one of the prompts was like, who would you talk to? So as well as her, like, would we talk to her family, or and then like kind of what's her relationship with her family, and actually maybe try and find out like, are these conversations she has at home, is it the kind of household where you can talk about politics or you can't? We thought that might be helpful as well.
Just we were talking about. I mean, in the scenario, the person is a social worker, but two of us at the table are teachers, so we were thinking about. It's very hard in schools to talk about theories of change, and actually, that's one of the most important things to understand as a young person, sort of going into the world. So, how do different people believe society changes? We're talking about the possibility of doing that in a way that stays on the right side of the kind of non-partisan requirements of teachers, but you know, I think there is a way. I think you can say, oh, some people think society changes like this, some people think it changes like this, and I think for this person that would be really helpful if her mind is going straight to sort of individual terrorism. It feels like it might be really useful to talk about different theories of struggle.
Yeah, absolutely. Did anyone talk about the second scenario, or want to share anything about that? I know a couple of people talked about the first. Or should we go to the first one? You guys were talking about scenario one. Did you want to kind of feedback on that a bit?
In the scenario, we are a teacher, and a boy in year 10 was talking about adolescence, and you overhear him saying that the protagonist did nothing wrong and the victim was a bitch that got what was coming to her. And he has a history of these sort of comments about women, and there is no domestic violence in the home. So we firstly talked about, in terms of the domestic violence aspect, how is that known? Is there social workers working with the family, or an independent domestic violence advocate from a charity working with them as well? So just getting like more information about it. We were talking as well about just leading with curiosity in this context. So, I mean, I was talking about my work, which is with 3-year-olds, not year 10s, but when I hear children say things like that, it's always, where did you hear that? Or, you know, what do you mean by that? Or like, because a lot of the time they don't actually know what they mean by what they've said. They haven't thought through the full context, and they might just be parroting something they've heard.
And also sometimes we can assume that that's something that's going on in the home, but, and I'm not trying to say that, like, you know, video games and films are, you know, polluting children's minds, but sometimes there is so much misogyny in our culture. It doesn't necessarily have to be because it's at home. Yeah. It could just be repeating what they're seeing on, you know, in TV and that kind of thing.
Yeah, we were saying that like teenage boys will just say things and not really think through. And so again, bringing in empathy is, and again, it's who has a relationship with his child, but bringing in empathy as well in terms of getting them to think about what they've said and what the consequences of that is. And we were just talking a lot about shame, how shame is just not an effective response, and obviously as an individual as well who hears these things, it's quite automatic to have quite an intrinsic negative reaction, and you want to say something and you want to make it okay straight away, but sometimes you do just need to take a step back and think about, maybe I'm not coming into this with the right headspace. And then lastly, I think we talked about, you know, it's one thing to sort of directly deal with this exact scenario that's in front of you, but also it's good to create a wider, I've forgotten how to speak, but to do things like in PSHE lessons, to have like proactive responses to talking about misogyny and other things like that, rather than just it dealing with individual scenarios.
Well, in that case, I'm going to hand over to Amy to wrap up. So thank you for your contribution to that. That was really interesting.
Awesome, thank you. So, moving on to, so again, don't try to read these slides. And also, I have to put a link at the end to where I've got these from, but I don't think they'd have minded I stole them. What can you do in schools? So try not to read that too much, but think about, so what can you do in schools, what can you do in your workplaces? It doesn't have to just be schools, this particular guidance is for them, but it's things like acknowledging hierarchy, asking for anti-racism training in your workplace, challenge gatekeeping, don't stereotype families, and then thinking about who you know that might be able to help. And I think for this one, I think it's okay to be creative and think outside the box sometimes. So I know that local authorities have lots of commission services or like different programs that they have, that they want people to signpost to. But I don't think it's a bad thing to try and think outside the box. When I worked with a young person in Lewisham that was getting into, lots of trouble with contextual safeguarding issues, that kind of thing, I signposted to Saving Souls FC, which was like a really nice football club that you could be part of, where afterwards they all talk about how they're feeling about things. When I worked with an Afghan family that were going to be evicted, and it was definitely a racialised eviction, I signposted them and went with them to the London Renters Union meeting. Unaccompanied asylum-seeking children in our workplace as well. They kept talking about the dangers of Easton, and I was like, what? We actually put him in touch with the mosque there. When I had a young person that was talking about watching lots of, what was it, the American guns and, what are they called? Mass shootings. He was watching lots of those and talking about how if he lived in America he would get a gun. And my manager said that's a prevent referral, but actually instead he was obsessed with Star Wars, and we did an entire piece of direct work over several weeks over like which character are you, and he started like I'm Kylo Ren, but at the end he was Luke Skywalker, and I asked him who am I, and he said Yoda, and I was like, oh, because I'm wise. He said no, because you're old. So yeah, think about those alternatives that you can think about. I mean, yeah, there are loads of different, the resources in your communities. And then think about how you can communicate in accessible and transparent ways. And I think particularly when it comes to recording, don't forget that people can access their records if they want to. And I think one of the best ways that you can think about, is this something that needs to be shared, because it's going to be on that record forever, and is this going to be helpful and useful, is write it to the child and the family. Address them directly. Because if you can't say it to their face, then why are you saying it to your colleagues? So that's my opinion on that. And then active listening, elicit feedback and response from people, try not to be a saviour if you can help it. And then I think the main takeaway, apart from those of the resources, is never forget that you are not just a service provider, you're a service user, and that we are all people that have these want for belonging and mental health issues, all that kind of thing. So you're not necessarily always the person that knows everything. And never forget it takes one person. When you don't have to be that person for everyone, but if we all collectively do this, then we might get through to the people that and have those interesting conversations, and you can probably learn a lot as well. So my experience of working with a particular family in Lewisham from the GRT community, it took 2 years to rebuild that trust, because that was the same local authority that took away where they were living. And how on earth could I expect that mother to have any trust in me whatsoever as someone who works for the state? And it took 2 years, but that relationship was one of the most transformative of my lives, and I think about that mum almost every day. It takes one person. If you are interested in the resources, so the one on the left is that training booklet, which is great, on radical safeguarding. And then this one's quite helpful. It's from Amnesty and Neon, a few other organisations, and it's about how you talk about prevent with colleagues, with people, in a way that is you don't fall into the traps and the tropes of the way in which prevent is framed. That's it. Thank you.
Oh yeah, sorry. So, thank you for coming. I hope people had some kind of interesting discussions and took things from it. I think I certainly learned a lot there. But so, yeah, kind of really good. So.